welcome to another edition of the Simsbury Woman. My name is Shannon Knall. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so thrilled with our guest today. She's kind of a Simsbury icon. She's been in the community, involved in so many aspects of what makes Simsbury great. Dominique Avery, welcome to the Simsbury Woman.
I'm delighted to be here and delighted actually to be on the other side of the desk, not doing the interviewing.
I know, and we will talk about your involvement with Simsbury Community Television as well as we move along through the program, but I'm glad I could provide a little variety in your life today.
Oh, thank you.
First of all, let's talk about Simsbury and your involvement in Simsbury and your commitment to the community. From all of the public service that you have done, let's just give us a brief outline of what your service to Simsbury has been like.
I moved to Simsbury in 1990 when my daughter was in 4th grade, and I think I was involved. I was a class mom or something, but I was really much more interested in doing something not more important but different, something more akin to what I had been doing before in my job life. And I'm a dedicated recycler. So the first thing I did was volunteer for the recycling committee. Mm-hmm. And I had the good fortune to meet Pam Katz, who was at the time a selectman. And I learned so much from her. She ran an absolutely impeccable meeting. She was amazing. And eventually, after a couple of other people, I became chairman. And I wrote a recycling column, a weekly column about recycling, and I love detail, so I did that. And then from there, I think I was involved in something having to do with recycling, and I ended up at the Bridge of Flowers, which wasn't the Bridge of Flowers then, and I had the idea to start the Bridge of Flowers.
Well, that was my next question, so you've segued beautifully for me from your work on the recycling committee into what was the old Drake Hill Bridge, which had been restored by the Board of Selectmen in the early 90s, and then you had the idea based on some other scenic bridges that you had seen.
There is a Bridge of Flowers in Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts, and I happen to have a friend who lives in Shelburne. And so I paid attention to it. One day I read an article, and then the two things came together. I thought, we have this lovely bridge that's been restored and painted and a new wooden floor, and it's gorgeous, but except for an occasional Tai Chi class, nobody's really going there. Mm-hmm. So I made my husband and my daughter stop in Shelburne Falls on the way to a vacation in Maine, and they both said, "Oh, Mom, what a stupid idea. Nobody's going to want to do a Bridge of Flowers," which of course made me that much more determined to do it.
Right.
So I went up there, and theirs is beautiful but different. But I thought, this can be done. Mm-hmm. And I knew a lot of people in town as the chair of the recycling committee. So when I came back, I both invited the gardener from the Shelburne Falls Bridge of Flowers and invited anybody in town who I could think of who might be interested. And we had a big meeting and talked about it. We had several meetings until the idea caught on.
And that was no small undertaking. So tell me a little bit about what that took from a grassroots perspective, because I imagine there was fundraising and there was volunteer work, all that needed to happen at the same time to make it what it is today.
So I think it took us about 6 months or we started planning in the fall. We had this guest gardener come, but it wasn't even that hard to do because the idea was a great one and people recognized it. So we had the garden club and there's 2 garden clubs and the beautification committee and parks and recreation. And businesses, Warner Nursery, what are they called? Warner, whatever the garden place is called, Pick and Patch. All these people got involved, and everybody was so enthusiastic. Yes, we had to have meetings. We organized what were we going to plant, how were we going to do it. The first year we had students at the high school build window boxes. I had this theory that if we had students involved, we might have less vandalism. Assistant town engineer, George Phillips, was heavily involved in engineering the watering system, everybody contributed.
Wonderful. So it sounds like it was a community building project.
It was a total community project. I like to say that I'm the godmother of the bridge, but it was just a project whose time had come. And I just wanted to mention that, and now I'm going to not mention it because now I can't remember her name. There was an artist in town, and her name just flew out of my head, who did the original sketches of what it might look like, and that's what we used for fundraising.
Wonderful.
We had brochures with her art on it, and I'm so embarrassed.
Oh, that's okay. Let's talk about what it means for you to see that bridge today as it stands.
Anybody, I like to tell people that so far in my life I've had a lot of accomplishments, but that's my proudest accomplishment. I think it'll be there forever, and it has become such an important thing for the community. And I think nobody really imagined how important it would be. I do remember in the beginning, there were people who said, I was also on the tourism committee at the time, and I saw it as a tourist draw, but there were people on that committee who said, oh God, no, we don't want anybody coming to see our bridge. We don't want buses coming to see our bridge. Of course, now we do want people coming to see our bridge and eat at our restaurants.
Right, and it has indeed become a landmark, so thank you for your contribution to what is now the Flower Bridge.
Sometimes I jokingly say I also needed something for my resume because I was home, I was bringing up my daughter, I wasn't working. So yeah, it was a nice thing to put on my resume. A project, right.
And a little bit about your other involvement in the town with the Board of Education and with Simsbury Community Television, where we are today. You've left your mark almost everywhere.
Right, thank you. So what else? Recycling, board, tourism, Board of Ed. I was in a former life a school teacher. I graduated from college and then went to Bank Street College of Education in New York to learn to be a teacher, and I taught school in New Haven for 5 years. And I thought I had quite a bit of expertise in education. I was a parent in town, and I somehow got in touch with the right people in town, and I was appointed to the Board of Ed, where I served for a 4-year term.
Wonderful. And your involvement with Simsbury Community Television, I know, is reflective of your career, which we will talk about in a few minutes, but I think it's very poignant as many volunteers in this community want to bring what they have done in their careers to their volunteer work in the community. And you had a wonderful career in television and broadcast media, and you've brought that expertise here to Simsbury Community Television. How have you touched this?
So I started when I was on the Board of Education, because while the Board of Ed meetings were both brought live and later broadcast on tape or digitally, we didn't get a lot of information. The ordinary person didn't get to hear a lot about what was going on in schools. So I began a show about school. I hosted a show about our schools with former Superintendent Joe Townsley. And I did that. That was my first entree into SCTV. And I did that for several years. And then I went back to work. So I was less involved, and I began again with Superintendent Diana Ullman, and now I'm doing a show for the next superintendent, Matt.
Wonderful, thank you. And this is, as intended, a wonderful vehicle for citizens in our community to learn more about what's going on with our boards and commissions and with our senior center, our recreational opportunities. So thank you for bringing your expertise to that as well.
I don't think that people in Simsbury truly appreciate what they have. It is an amazing thing for a community the size of ours, 20-something thousand people, to have their very own television station. It's underused. Not enough people are doing shows, hosting shows. Not enough people watch. Not enough people put community announcements up.
Right.
I think people just don't really know that it exists. But when you look at what's happening in the media these days, and the newspaper business and how little reporting goes on a
Right.
community. We are so lucky because we could have a news show if there were people involved. We could have a news show, at least a weekly news show. And we're not very rich. And we could use a lot more contributions for people, individuals and businesses. But a town like Avon does not have its own television show station. It's
Right.
part of a group called Nutmeg
Right.
TV with 6 or 7 towns.
Right.
Simsbury is so fortunate because our boards and commissions, most of them are on television.
Yes.
People can see what's going
Yes.
on.
Yes.
And I think, Simsbury is an extraordinary community. You've been here for a very long time, you know that. But I think a lot of people here take that for granted. And I think there is a connection between SCTV and the extraordinary community that we have.
Absolutely.
Because there are people here, they know more about their community, and there is a sense of community that Avon, for instance, doesn't have.
No, I would agree that this is part of what makes Simsbury Simsbury, is that we have another unique opportunity to share with people what we're all about. And I would hope that, and I try to do my part to have people become aware of what SCTV
Well,
has
I
to
mean,
offer.
and you're doing a show, and it's wonderful. But I want other people. I mean,
Yes.
you're very good at it, and I know there are a lot of people who feel uncomfortable.
Yes.
But they could come. We actually have a teleprompter, and it helps. You can do an introduction on the teleprompter, and people here can help. So, I didn't really think about how I would talk about SCTV today, but to me, it's very important that more people get involved. People get involved on the board as volunteers, doing shows. And especially young people.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a nice transition to your career. So now you touched on it a little bit. You started off as a teacher, a noble profession for sure. At a time in our history, if you will, where that was sort of what women were supposed to do, either become a teacher or a nurse. And so you became a teacher, and then I will refer to you as sort of the accidental journalist after that.
Absolutely true.
So take us through how you became the accidental journalist.
Okay, it's actually a funny story. The last year that I actually taught, I had a child in my class who had a learning disability or a behavioral disability. At the time, there wasn't the kind of testing that's going on now. It was really unsure, but he had out of control anger issues, and I couldn't teach, the other kids couldn't learn. It was just an awful year. And I took my job very seriously, and I had insomnia. I could not sleep. So I often turned on the radio, and I was listening to FM rock station. And one night when I couldn't sleep, I called the radio station, which is very unlike me to do something
In the
like
middle
that.
of the night.
In the middle of the night. And the person who answered was the disc jockey, and he and I began to talk. And at the time, I was very into rock music. I was dating the rock critic for the Village Voice. And this disc jockey and I began to talk. And we talked, since I had insomnia every night, we began to talk a lot. And one night he asked me where I lived. It turned out my apartment in the middle of downtown New Haven was right around the corner from the rock station. So he said, I'll open the back door. And I went up. And long story short, a relationship developed. But in the midst of this relationship, I also observed what it took to be a disc jockey. And I went Yale. This was the early 70s. Yale was very into opening its doors to the community. So they did a series of training sessions for people to learn how to operate a radio station.
Wow.
I took that course. I got whatever license or whatever I needed to work there. And in the summer, they hired 4 Yale students to run the radio station when everybody else was on vacation. And they hired me to be their vacation fill-in. That's a very long introduction to this story. So there I was at Yale filling in for these disc jockeys, all of whom have gone on to be sort of famous people,
Wow.
including John Perellis, who is the New York Times rock critic. And the phone rang. And I answered the phone, nobody else was there, and it turned out to be a news director at one of the local radio stations who was looking for someone to come and write news copy for an anchor that he had that couldn't write.
Oh.
I answered the phone. I said, there's nobody here. He said, would you like to come and try out? And I did.
And that was it.
And that was it.
That's
And I mean, I walked into the newsroom and I said, you know, where have you been all my life? This was this is where I wanted to be. And for a while I was still working as a disc jockey at another station in Hartford, playing music, but music was not, news was what I wanted to do. So I didn't go on the air right away. I wrote copy, I worked as a reporter, I did rounds, I learned how to be a reporter, and then eventually they put me on in the middle of the night. And then I got a daytime shift, and then I was actually made news director. And my biggest claim to fame there is that I hired Jerry Brooks, his first job out of college.
Oh.
And he started on the midnight shift like I had.
Wow. But this was a time also that women weren't doing this. Women were not in broadcast media. They were just starting to kind of, you know, crack the door a little bit. But this, you were not the majority population.
Right, it wasn't. And there was a consultant who was sort of overseeing the station the way a lot of rock stations had oversight from national consultants. And he was not at all comfortable with my being on the air. And he made me change my name. I couldn't use the name Dominique. I had to use my middle name Anne, so I was Anne Avery. But my bosses, Copps and Monahan, were not at all opposed to it. It wasn't a problem for them at all. I did not feel like I was breaking ground. It just happened. I could write. I was well educated. I could write copy. I could learn quickly, and I'm a natural reporter. And it turned out that was a really good fit. But I didn't really feel like it was a big deal until I was named news director. And that was a big deal, and they did do a press release on it. But they were very proud of the fact that I was the first middle market news director in the country. Of course, I was fired as news director a year later when the consultant said, her voice isn't big enough, so they brought in some big voice person, and then I left after a while.
But regardless, whether you felt it at the time or not, that was certainly...
Well, it's sort of groundbreaking.
Right. That was very impactful, I'm sure. And is there any difference today when you look at the women in the media or in broadcast media specifically?
It's all women now.
Yeah.
And all the best reporters, I think, are women. Yeah, there's a lot of women on the air. Every time I listen to a radio station, a disc jockey now. Women, a lot of women. It's just very, very different.
Would you give any specific advice to young women who were coming out of college and just trying to get into a very competitive field?
It's extraordinarily competitive. What happened to me, and we'll probably talk about how I got into television later, what happened to me was I was in the right place at the right time, and I had the right skills. Right. But that could never happen now. I could not get a job the way I got a job then, now. I mean, there would be 1,000 people trying to knock down the door for the few jobs that there are.
Right. So let's talk about your time at WFSB. How has that shaped you? How is that?
Well, can I tell the story of how I got that job? It's another phone call job. I had left New Haven and AVZ, where I had started working, to go to the first all-new station in Connecticut, which was in Hartford. It was WPOP, still is WPOP, but it was a news station. And I was the morning anchor. I had a co-anchor, but I was there all the time in the morning, and everybody who was driving to work heard me. And one day the phone rang, and it was for my boss, who happened to be the same boss, and he wasn't there, and it was the news director at Channel 3, WFSB.
Wow.
And he recognized my voice because he listened to me every morning. And he said, "Oh, Dominique, we're hiring a reporter." And they were replacing their only woman reporter. "Are you interested?" And I hated working the early morning shift, and I said, well, yeah, maybe.
Time.
So he said, well, come to the station, come up with something to do an audition, a story to do an audition on, and then they hired me. And there were a lot of other women, a lot of other people trying to get the job. They were looking for a woman, and my competition for that job was somebody very interesting. It was Emily Rooney. Emily Rooney is Andy Rooney's daughter, and she went on to, she didn't get the job, but as I was there, she ended up coming to the assignment desk a little bit later, but she went on to have a huge career in the media in New York. She was, she's had a huge career, and in Boston she hosts a show on television now on their public station.
But the work that you did at WFSB earned you some accolades from those in the media and your peers. So that must have been something that you were proud of, as you should be.
Well, what I was most proud of, Connecticut Magazine once named me one of the top 3 reporters in the state. And the reason I got that honor was because I showed sensitivity and cried when I interviewed in a death situation or a funeral or something. And I didn't like that too much at the time. I wanted to be tough. But I was proud of the fact that I listened to people, I was sensitive.
Brought some sort of human element to the news.
But by that time, I mean, the change happened from one woman to lots of women reporters. I was there for 5 years. By the time I left, half the reporters were women or more. It turned out they were good. They worked hard. Often they worked harder than the men. And so it was also a very easy transition. The anchor desk, the national anchor desk, that was a challenge. I mean, Barbara Walters had this terrible experience where becoming an anchor with Harry Reasoner on ABC, and he didn't want her there, and it was awful.
Right.
And she had to leave.
Right. Well, again, regardless of how you felt as a potential pioneer in the industry, I'm sure that you were, and I'm sure that you opened some doors for a lot of women to get into that field, which then goes, let's talk about your work at CTN with at the Legislative Office Building and at the Capitol, and covering, groundbreaking legislation and meetings, and again going to that form of open government as something like SCTV purports as well.
Right. Between the time I left Channel 3 and CTN, I was, for my whole time in Simsbury, I stayed home. I had a child, stayed home with my child. I had thought that I was going to go back to work immediately. I sort of thought, oh, daycare, drop her off. I couldn't leave her. I didn't want to leave her. And then we moved out of Connecticut. So I was in New York then for almost 10 years, and there was no way I was going to work in New York media. It was just much too tough. So I was taking care of an elderly mother, my daughter. My daughter ended up when she went to college, my mother died around the same time. So then I began looking for work again, and CTN was born just about the same time.
Perfect.
And it was like perfect timing. And I actually, the way I got that job was sort of interesting too. It's very hard to transition back into the workforce. I interviewed for a lot of jobs before CTN came along, and even at CTN I had an interview scheduled, but I had to cancel it because my daughter had her wisdom teeth removed and had a terrible experience. And then they didn't call me back. So I wrote an op-ed piece in the Hartford Courant about how difficult it is to transition back into the workforce once you've stayed home. And I used that op-ed piece to put my whole resume in there so that my boss, he was sitting over his morning coffee and he said, oh, yes, that's the person I'm interested in. So he hired me. And it was a great job because I was there from the beginning. It was the ground floor job, so I was part of creating this network, what we were going to put on television. We knew that we were going to broadcast the legislature, but we ended up broadcasting so much more than that. And that was all my job and my responsibility to get that going.
Well, I'm a big fan of CTN. I watch it pretty faithfully throughout the year, specifically during the legislative session. So thank you for your mark on that.
That's another thing that Connecticut has that a lot of states don't have, and I think the people in Connecticut don't really appreciate the fact that they have this.
Really quickly, I just want to wrap up. We only have a couple more minutes, believe it or not. This went very quickly. But we've been talking a little bit about this transparency and accessibility for the general public to our government through the media. So take me back to talk briefly about your grandfather in Germany and how he perhaps shaped some of how you feel about this.
Hard to talk about briefly, but my grandfather was a member of the German parliament, the Reichstag, in 1933 when Hitler came to power. My grandfather was of the other strongest party. He's a member of the Social Democrat Party, and he was Jewish. He was arrested in the power grab that the Nazis did. They were not properly elected. They never achieved a majority, electoral majority. And what they did was they then arrested all of their opposition in one fell swoop in every single state, all over. And my grandfather was one of the first people. He should have had immunity as a member of parliament. He didn't. He was put in jail and then put in a concentration camp. And a year later, he was murdered. This was 1934, before anybody in the world really was paying attention. And I sort of feel like that experience, the experience that the Germans, it's all very complicated, but that they went through just sort of has informed my life, my whole life, about the importance of paying attention to your government and making sure you have good people there and watching.
Right. Well, that's a fascinating story. I wish we had more time to talk about it, but however that has shaped who you are and what your contributions have been to the community and to the broadcast industry and to ensuring that there is some transparency in government and some open access to government. We thank you for that, because I think that's a very important thing for any community to have. So thank you for all the work that you've done on that
You're
realm.
welcome.
So I just want to say in closing that we are grateful that you were here today to share with us some of your background in the Simsbury community, your background in television, and share with us a little bit about your personal history so we could get to know you a little bit better here on the Simsbury Woman. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you'll come back again.
Thank you for having me. I love to talk, so I was happy to do it.
All right. Thank you, Dominique Avery. Thank you for joining us here on the Simsbury Woman. We'll hope to see you again soon.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.